Scary Mystery Stories. Edgar Allan Poe. The Black Cat. I know you will not believe me, and indeed it would be insane to expect faith in such an incident, which you cannot verify by the testimony of your own senses. I am neither mad nor delirious. But tomorrow I must die, and today I would like to ease my soul. I would like to state clearly, in sequence, but without comment, a series of ordinary domestic events. By their consequences these events have afflicted, tormented, and ruined me. I will not attempt to explain them. To me they seem terrible, to many they will seem only inconsequential. Afterward, perhaps, a man will be found who will make a general place of me, a man with a head more calm and logical and not so excited as mine, will find that the circumstances of which I recount with horror are no more than the natural outcome of a very ordinary cause. I have been famous from childhood for meekness of character and humanity. My wonderfully tender heart made me the laughing stock of my companions. I went completely crazy over animals, and my parents allowed me to keep them. Almost all the time I spent with them, and was quite happy only when I fed and caressed them. This peculiarity of my character grew stronger over the years, and when I became an adult it became my main source of pleasure. I have nothing to explain the pleasure of affection to those who have ever owned a faithful and intelligent dog. There is something in the unselfish love of an animal, in its self-sacrifice, that penetrates right into the soul of a man who has had more than once occasion to test the tenuous friendship and fidelity of the natural man. I married early, and fortunately found in my wife the same inclinations as mine. Knowing my love of pets, she never missed an occasion to deliver me the best specimens. We had birds, a goldfish, a great dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. The cat was of remarkable stature and beauty, was completely black in color and unusually bright. Speaking of its cleverness, my wife, who was no stranger to prejudice, often referred to the old belief that all black cats were werewolves. It cannot be said that my wife always said this in earnest, and I mention her words only because they have now occurred to me. Pluto, that was the cat's name, was my favorite companion. I fed him myself, and he followed me wherever I went. Thus our friendship lasted for several years, during which my character, under the influence of indiscretion, which I am ashamed to confess, changed completely in a bad way. I began to treat my wife roughly, and even to the point of personal violence. My poor favorites, of course, endured even more. I retained some affection for Pluto, but with the others, the rabbits, the monkey, and even the dog, I treated them cruelly, even when they ran toward me with affection. But my unhappy weakness took more and more possession of me. What calamity can compare with the passion for wine? At last even Pluto, now old and weak, began to feel the change in my character. One night I came home very drunk, and imagining that Pluto was avoiding me, I seized him. Pluto, frightened by my violence, bit me lightly on the arm. I was suddenly seized with diabolical rage. I did not remember myself. The archdevil's anger, kindled by the genie, pervaded my whole being. I pulled a penknife from my vest pocket, opened it, grabbed the cat by the scruff of the neck and poked its eye out. I blush, I burn with shame, I shudder to write of this accursed cruelty. When, with the coming of morning, my prudence returned, when the vapors of the night's revelry had dissipated, I felt both horror and remorse. But the feeling was weak and fleeting. I indulged in immoderate drinking again, and soon drowned in wine the memory of my transgression. Meanwhile, the cat was recovering slowly. Although the eye socket was horrible to look at, Pluto seemed to be suffering no more. He walked, as usual, about the house, and, as might be expected, ran away with undescribed terror at my approach. There was still so much feeling in me that at first I was distressed at the apparent antipathy of the creature who had once loved me so much. But this feeling was soon replaced by irritation. And then, as if for my final and irrevocable downfall, the spirit of malice appeared in me. Philosophy does not pay attention to this feeling, but meanwhile, and I know it, perhaps, better than anyone, anger is the main engine of the human heart, one of the first invisible feelings that give direction to the character. Who has not committed hundreds of times stupid or bad deeds only because they should not have done them? Is there not a constant urge in us, in spite of common sense, to break the law just because we realize that it is the law? The spirit of wickedness, I say, has completed my final fall. This passionate, elusive desire of the soul to torture itself, to rape its own temperament, to do evil only out of love of evil, has impelled me to continue, and finally to complete the torment I inflict upon a defenseless animal. One morning I quite cold-bloodedly put a noose around the cat's neck and hung it from a tree limb. I hanged the cat with tears in my eyes, with bitter remorse in my heart. I hanged it because I knew that it loved me, and because I felt that it was not guilty before me. I hanged it because I knew that in doing so I was committing a crime so terrible that it placed my immortal soul, if it were possible, beyond the infinite mercy of the forgiving and punishing judge. On the night of the day on which my cruel deed was committed, I was awakened by cries of fire. The curtains of my bed were already on fire. The whole house was on fire. My wife, maid, and I escaped the fire with great difficulty. The destruction was complete. My entire fortune was lost. From that moment on, I gave myself up to despair. I'm not trying to find a mystical connection between my cruelty and my misfortune. But I am aware of a whole chain of facts, and I do not wish to neglect any of them. The day after the fire I went to inspect the ashes. All the walls, with the exception of one, had collapsed, and that single exception happened to be the inner wall, quite thin, running across the house, and against which the headboard of my bed leaned. The stonework resisted the action of the fire almost perfectly, which I attribute to the fact that the wall had recently been newly finished. A crowd had gathered around the wall, and several people were looking at it intently. My curiosity was stimulated by the words, "Strange, marvelous." I approached and saw something like a bas-relief depicting a giant cat on the white surface of the wall. The image was rendered remarkably faithfully. A rope could be seen around its neck. I thought it was a vision, and I was terrified. But at last my reason came to my aid. I remembered that the cat had been hung in the garden adjoining the house. At the cry for help, our garden was immediately filled with people, and the cat had probably been taken down from the tree and thrown into my room, through the open window, to wake me up. As the walls fell, one of them pressed the victim of my cruelty against the fresh plaster, and the lime, united with the ammonia of the corpse, produced a figure. But I quickly quieted only my mind, but not my conscience, and the phenomenon made a deep impression on my imagination. For months I could not rid myself of the ghost of the cat, and something akin to remorse appeared in my soul. I mourned the loss of the animal, and in the disgraceful brothels which I now frequented, I began to look for another pet of the same breed and appearance as Pluto to replace him. One evening, in one more than disgraceful brothel, my attention was attracted by a black object sitting on the top of one of the enormous gin or rum casks that made up the main decoration of the room. For some minutes I gazed intently at the top of the cask, and was most surprised that I had not noticed the object before. I went over and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large black cat, exactly as large as Pluto, but only with the difference that Pluto had not a single white spot on his whole body, while this one had a large white spot, irregularly shaped, occupying almost the entire chest. As soon as I touched the cat, it stood up, purred heavily and began to rub against my hand, evidently pleased with my attention. I asked the owner to sell me the cat, but the owner said that it was not his, that he did not know it, that he had never seen it. I continued to caress the animal and, noticing that it expressed a desire to follow me, I beckoned it and brought it home. The cat settled down immediately, as if it were at home, and became very friendly with my wife. But I soon felt an antipathy to the animal, that is, an antipathy to what I wanted. I do not know why or how it happened, but the cat's caresses were disgusting to me and made me tired. The feeling of disgust and fatigue turned gradually into hatred. I avoided the animal. The consciousness of shame and the recollection of my first cruel act prevented me from treating it badly. For some weeks I refrained from rudeness, but little by little I began to look upon the cat with inexpressible horror, and to avoid its nasty presence like the plague. My hatred arose, probably, from the fact that the next day, as I brought the cat to me, I noticed that, like Pluto, it had but one eye. Meanwhile, this circumstance made the cat dear in the eyes of my wife, who possessed in the highest degree tender feelings. Yes, they were once also my characteristic traits, and then they served me as a source of simple and pure pleasure. The cat's attachment to me grew in proportion to my aversion to her. She followed my footsteps with a persistence that is hard to explain. As soon as I sat down, she would scoot under my chair or jump up on my lap to be petted. When I stood up, she huddled under my feet, almost dropping me, or, clinging with her long claws to my dress, climbed up to my chest. At these moments I wanted very much to kill it with one blow, but I was prevented, partly by the memory of my first crime, and most importantly, and I will not hide it, by fear of the animal. This fear was not a fear of physical pain, and yet it would be difficult for me to define it otherwise. I am almost ashamed to admit, yes, even in this cell of criminals I am almost ashamed to admit, that the fear and disgust instilled in me by the animal was intensified by such a chimera, which is very difficult to understand. My wife several times called my attention to the figure of the white spot of which I have spoken, and in which lay the only difference between the strange animal and the cat I had killed. The reader may remember that this spot, though large, had at first no definite shape, but slowly, gradually, quite imperceptibly, so that I at length attributed it to imagination, it assumed definite outlines. The stain represented an object which I was afraid to name. It was the chief cause that made me hate the monster. I would have killed him, too, if I had dared. The stain represented a horrible, fatal thing. It represented a scaffold, resembling horror and crime, agony and death. After this I became, indeed, as unhappy as only man can be unhappy. A senseless animal, the like of which I destroyed with contempt. A stupid, senseless animal constituted the terrible and unbearable misery of man, created in the image of God. Alas! I knew no more peace, day or night. During the day the animal did not leave me for a minute, and at night, as soon as I woke up from a terrible, disturbing dream, I felt its warm breath on my face and its terrible weight on my heart. It was my constant nightmare. Overwhelmed by fear, I lost the last good that still remained in my soul, and the darkest, most evil thoughts took possession of me. My ordinary longing grew to hatred of everything and everyone. My wife, meek and never murmuring, became, alas, and patient victim of the sudden, frequent, and irresistible outbursts of rage to which I was now blindly indulging. Once she went with me to do some household chores in the cellar of the old house in which we were obliged by our poverty to live. The cat followed me up the steep stairs, and when it got under my feet it made me furious. Raising the axe, in a rage, forgetting the fear that had hitherto stopped me, I wanted to strike the animal a blow, and probably a fatal one, if I had succeeded, but the blow was stopped by my wife's hand. Her interference made me furious, and I freed my hand and split its skull with the axe. The poor woman fell dead without a cry. Having committed the murder, I immediately took measures to hide the corpse. I realized that I could not take the body out of the house, day or night, without being seen. Many objects came into my mind. There was a moment when I wanted to cut my wife's body into pieces and burn it. Then I decided to dig a hole in the cellar. Then it occurred to me to throw the body into the well in the yard, then to put it in a box like merchandise, and have a messenger carry it away from the house. Finally, I settled on a thought that seemed to me better than the others. I decided to bury it in the cellar wall, as medieval monks, it is said, used to bury their victims. The cellar was very convenient for such an idea. Its walls were laid very carelessly and covered with plaster, which could not be strengthened by dampness. There was also a hollow in one of the walls from a former stove or hearth, also laid in like the rest of the cellar walls. I had no doubt that it would have been easy to remove the bricks in this place, put a body in their place, and still brick up the whole place, so that no eye could discover anything suspicious. I had not miscalculated. With a chisel I easily removed the bricks, and having placed the body standing upright, tied against the wall, I held it in this position until the bricks were laid down. With all possible precautions I got lime, sand, and stubble, prepared plaster, and carefully plastered the newly laid wall. When I had finished the work, I was satisfied with it. The wall had not the slightest appearance of deterioration. I then carefully picked up all the debris and cleaned the floor. My first move, when I had finished, was to find the cat, which I was determined to kill. Had I been able to meet it at that moment, its fate would have been decided, but the agile animal seemed alarmed at my recent fury, and would not show itself to my sight. It is impossible to imagine or describe the gratifying sense of contentment that arose in me from the absence of the hated animal. The cat did not appear all night, and it was the first good night I had slept soundly since the cat was introduced into our house. Yes, I slept well, in spite of the murder on my conscience. The second and third day passed, and my executioner did not appear. Once more I sighed like a free man. The beast had left my house in fear. So I would never see him again. My happiness was complete. The criminality of my dark deed troubled me very little. A sort of inquest was held, but it ended happily. An inquiry was even appointed, but of course it could discover nothing. I thought my safety was assured. But on the fourth day after the murder, the police suddenly came to my house and again began a thorough search. Believing in the immaculateness of my work, I did not feel the slightest uneasiness. The police invited me to be present during the search and left no corner unexamined. Finally, for the third or fourth time, we went down into the cellar. Not a muscle in my face quivered. My heart beat calmly, like a man with the most innocent conscience. I paced the cellar from corner to corner, crossing my arms over my chest and looking around with contentment. The police were perfectly satisfied and were about to leave. I was jubilant. I was impatient to say one word of triumph, and doubly to convince the police of my innocence. "Gentlemen," I said at last, when all had gone up the stairs, I am delighted to have allayed your suspicion. I wish you good health and a little more courtesy. Let me say in passing that this house is of a strikingly good construction, wishing, by all means, to speak unostentatiously. I did not know what I was saying. I may say that this house is beautifully built. These walls, are you going away, gentlemen? These walls are built superbly. And then, out of foolish boastfulness, I thumped hard with the stick that happened to be in my hand on the place where the corpse of my dear wife had been buried. Ah! God grant that I may be saved from the devil's claws. As soon as the sound of my blows was heard in the cellar, there came from the grave an answer, a complaint, at first quiet and intermittent, like the sobbing of a child, then a long, sharp cry, a strange, inhuman shriek, not of horror, not of triumph, such as can only be heard in hell, the dreadful sounds that can come from the breast of tortured sufferers, or from the throat of the devil. I cannot tell you what was going on in me. I felt that I was losing consciousness, and, staggering, I leaned against the opposite wall. The policeman, struck with terror, stopped on the stairs. A moment later, 20 strong hands were dismantling the wall. It collapsed at once. A body, already decomposing, stood upright before the spectators. On its head, with its bloody mouth open and its single eye gleaming, sat the horrible beast that had engaged me in the murder and whose treacherous voice had betrayed me to the executioner. I bricked the beast into the wall.